Okay, so welcome everyone. In case anyone missed it before, we do have captions running today from My Clear Text, and please just use the CC button or closed captions button on the bottom of your screen to turn those on. We are recording the session now, and if there's anything we can do to make this more accessible, please just ask. The chat section is easy for that. So what we'd like to share today is the research that we've been conducting over the course of the last 4 weeks, and some of the takeaways that we've got from that. So it is pretty summarised if you think about, this is the first 2 weeks of the research, but every day we've got this daily insights coming through. But we'll just pick the highlights of that and the bits that we think are most relevant for organisations to be able to design into. We'll talk about the participants we've got involved, and the first two initial themes, which are communication was our week 1 theme, and getting food and basics was our week 2 theme. Some of the key actionable insights from that, what's coming up next, and we'd like to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So this research, I mean, the key at the moment is this is really very unusual times for us all, and something that we've moved into very quickly and with very little time to prepare and plan for as individuals and as organisations. So what we realised is that match between people's needs and capabilities and the ability to design and support changing needs in a very fast adapting environment is very tricky when we don't understand where people's challenges are moving to. So we decided to ask our panel. We initially started just with the panel leads, who each represent one of the communities of different access needs across the panel. And then we've expanded that into the broader panel by the time we moved to week 1. So we did a kind of week 0 test pilot, and then a 6-week project with 13 participants. The real goal of this was to help organisations understand and design for the environment that we're in now. Obviously, this environment is also very fast moving. So what we were designing for 4 weeks ago is not what we're designing for now, and will not be what people are living through in 4 weeks' time. So hence we use the approach of a diary study so that we can follow people through across time and look at those changes as people adapt to the new environment and as that new environment is adapting itself. It is something just to recognise that wherever we're at today is going to be out of date quite quickly, but it gives us a good sense of how people are managing that, where some of those the really big challenges are, and how we can best support those needs. We have involved, it's a very narrow study, so just, the first thing, there's 13 participants, so it's a very qualitative study. It is not at all quantitative. It's very diverse, so we've got the maximum diversity for the minimum number of people. But if you think that we have 5 days a week of video coming in from 13 people for 6 weeks, that's still a huge volume of material to go through, analyse and understand. Some people are providing a written diary. The majority of people are doing it in video format, and everyone's sharing some photos that illustrate some of the challenges and some of the joys and delights of their days as well. We have 6 core themes that Tom will take you through in a moment, just to help people consider what are the elements of most relevance and to kind of give them a little bit of a trigger as to what to think of next. And each week we're doing a bit of a deep dive into one of those themes. And then we've gone through that in terms of the insights. And it's really so that organisations and individuals can start to work with the environment as it is, as opposed to as it was. Tom.
Okay, hi everyone. Don't know if every one of you know me. I'm Tom, Research Director at Open, and I am going to take you through some of the themes here that we were looking at in this diary study. So essentially there's 6 themes, and for all of these themes, as Christine just mentioned, we want to know what's changing, the challenges, the adaptions, the breakthroughs, and then also what opportunities are presented potentially by these changes in behavior and approach. Maybe new ways of coping, connecting, managing, etc. So the 6 core themes are communication, food, and basics, and these are the 2 that we're going to discuss today.
Sorry, I'm jumping out of that for one moment just to check no one's in the waiting room.
Okay. Health and fitness, work, finances, and leisure and entertainment. And just to very briefly summarize each of these themes, with communication, we're looking at what platforms are people engaging with, what issues are arising, what interesting new styles may be emerging. With food and basics, well, obviously, we all still need to eat and buy household essentials like toiletries and other things like that. So how are we getting these things? What's the delivery like? Etc. And also this also translates to food preparation as well at home. So are people cooking more and so on. Health and fitness, you know, what are people doing to keep their physical health up? Have any fallen ill? Have any fallen ill with COVID or some other form of illness? How is their mental health? So health and fitness here includes mental health as well. And what's working and what's not. In work, we've got what are new strategies perhaps being used for working from home, from isolation. Do people have work? Are people furloughed? Are people looking for work, etc. With finances, we've got what are personal challenges or pluses in personal finances. So what's working, what's not, and how are banks and other organizations like government organizations helping personal finance management? And for leisure and entertainment, you know, how do people pass the time? How do they enjoy switching off from everything that's happening in the world? And what do they do? And again, are there any differences there from prior to the lockdown?
Sorry, Tom, I'm just going to stop that for one moment. I've got it back right. So, thank you.
No worries.
Right, now I can get that back on.
Yeah, we don't want too many people waiting in the waiting room.
Sorry, I just couldn't get back to it while I was in that screen sharing mode. There you go.
Yeah. Oh, now we see your browser.
There you go.
There we go. Okay, I think we're seeing the notes view of the slide. Sorry. Which is fine for me, but
right.
There we go. All right, so moving on to the next, I'll just take you very quickly through the demographics. There we go. So as Christine mentioned, we know our cohort is small. This, of course, allows us to get nice, rich, deeper insights qualitatively. Across our 13 people, we have a wide range of access needs and adaptation approaches, including assistive technologies and various adaptive tools. You can see the statistics there. Next slide. We are biased towards more women than men, gender bias. Other than that, our ages are quite diverse. Our youngest participant is in her early 20s. Our oldest participant is over 80. We have 85% of people who identify as disabled, and of those who don't, they are above 65 and would fall into a category that we call just getting older, in that they may have access needs, but they don't identify as having access needs. And then there's a variety of living situations and employment statuses, stati, in any case. So the majority are self-employed. There's some full-time employed. Interestingly, at the time that we are presenting this diary study for these 2 weeks, we have 0 furloughs, but that has changed over time. So there you go. Most live with a partner or spouse, some with their parents because they're still students or they're younger people, and 8% live alone. Over to Christine.
Thank you. So the themes from week 1 and 2, as we mentioned, the first theme was communication, and our second theme that we looked at was getting food and basics. So just to kind of remind people of what was happening at the beginning of that period, this is the period that started on the 20th of April. And as a reminder, that was the week just after the weekend where One World Together at Home concert was. In terms of the news that week, there was a huge amount of noise around PPE and the shortage of that in the NHS, and that probably dominated most of the papers that week. The borders were still open, even though there was the lockdown had commenced, and the government furlough scheme came into force during that week, in fact, on the first day of that fortnight period. Overall, it was just when the UK was realising, I think, that the uptake of COVID-19 in the UK was likely to be significant. It had just been noted that it would probably exceed Italy or Spain. In terms of how people were feeling in those first 2 weeks, in terms of health, work and communication, they were the 3 biggest themes that people spoke about. And so you can see here on the top graph there's the various themes. And in the week 1, the number 1 spoken about theme was communication, which we particularly asked people to do. So that's not at all surprising. Number 2 was health and fitness. Number 3 was work. Then leisure and entertainment. There was an other, food and essentials, and finances last. In week 2, the number 1 theme was food and essentials, which again was the key theme for the week, so not surprising. Then health and fitness, work, communication, other, entertainment and finances. And I think probably finances is the lowest also. Just in the UK, people don't tend to like to talk about their finances too much. So unless we specifically ask that, that tends to be lower down. In terms of the change in how people felt from week 1 to week 2, on the bottom graph there you can see that the week 1, all of the emotions were a little bit higher, apart from stressed, which went up a little bit in week 2 but is quite low in both. But happy, frustrated, thankful and fearful and even angry were all higher emotions in week 1 than week 2. And I think some of this was as people got more settled into the period of lockdown, that overall emotion, either positive or negative, started to come down a little bit, and it became a little bit of the new normal. And that's when we first started hearing that phrase, the new normal, being used. A number of people in the survey, in the study, spoke about the fact that they just didn't want to read the bad news all the time, and all news seemed to be about coronavirus. Some limited what time of day they'd look at it or read it. Others just chose to read less of it. There were some positive stories that came from it as well. So things like the Clap for Carers, which was just kind of getting going and really building a momentum, did give people a bit of an uplift and that feeling of thankfulness and happiness during their week as well. And people were beginning to get used to it. So you know, that initial adaptation, particularly for organisations like supermarkets and banks, was becoming a little bit more stable, and people were kind of becoming more aware of what this environment was like and how they can adapt in their own world to that. So in terms of communication, there were 4 kind of really big takeaways that when we summarised all the input we got to. The first thing, not at all surprising for us all, as you see me be a little clunky with Zoom, is there was a deluge of new tools for everyone to learn. So Zoom, Google Hangouts, Facebook video, all of this, this was needing to be learned. Sorry, Tom, I just realized I'm speaking to your slide. Would you like to take over?
No problem, no problem. I was like, oh, okay.
Sorry.
New setup here. Right, so no problem. So yeah, we kind of divided it. Christine's going to talk about week 2. I'll talk about week 1. So the theme of the week was communication, as Christine just said. Here are some of the themes that came out of that. So there's a wide range of tools being used, Zoom, Google Hangouts, Facebook video, Skype, WhatsApp, and this includes by older users as well. So they are on these platforms, they're trying them, they're actually accessible enough that they can get on them. That being said, some of our panel members, like our blind participant, was doing a lot of coaching of other people who are vision impaired to help them get up and running on Zoom. So there have been some challenges. But speaking to the second point, where the tech tools are more accessible than usable, what do we mean by that? Well, so essentially, these platforms, participants have reported them being accessible in that they can access them. But in terms of the usability, there was a few things that were lacking. So to give you an example, our dyslexic dyspraxic participant, who's in her 40s, she has a full-time job, and she's of course working from home like all of us now. She found Zoom very difficult to use as a dyslexic because so many text-based links and messages were being passed around, and she was having essentially to multitask with these text-based links. And of course, after the call, she couldn't access the links anymore. So this caused her significant energy drain and kind of mental effort to try to keep up, and she felt she simply couldn't do it. Another person who had trouble with the usability of the online platforms was our BSL, deaf BSL participant, because of course broadband issues were factoring in here and causing freezing of his BSL interpreter. And that really made him feel isolated on the calls. He couldn't simply keep up with the conversation. And as he put it, he felt like an outsider. Number 3, old formats for new connections. So here we found, interestingly, that old-time communication, such as discussing things with your, saying a friendly word to your neighbor over the fence, was being used. In particular, our older participant with multiple sclerosis, who is actually quite concerned about her health and is staying for the full 5-6 weeks, has been isolating at home, not going out at all. She's been talking with her neighbors over the fence and finding that to be a relief. She also was a big fan of the Clap for Carers, when the neighbors came out on their front lawn together and would do this activity. So these older formats are being used more for new connections. And number 4, finally, what do we mean by this? This is the classic scenario of extreme situations lead to more robust solutions for more people. So some participants, for example, our young student in her 20s who has Crohn's disease, was describing how she would like to have certain alternative formats presented for her in order to study for her exams. These had been rejected by the university. Now, of course, she's finding access to these much more readily and is very happy for that. And as a result, she hopes that when the COVID crisis is over, that access remains to these, essential resources. So that's just a snippet of what we were finding. And here's some quotes directly from our participants on these points. So on the left here, you see our female participant in her 40s, dyslexic, dyspraxic, and she's talking about this trouble she has multitasking on Zoom for work calls. And as she says there, it's quite frustrating. It's a challenge. It will always be, probably because of my dyslexia. On the right, we have a participant who's in her 20s. She lives with her mom and dad and is neurodiverse. So she has low IQ and has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. What's interesting with her is she mentioned that Zoom was easy enough to use, but all of her friends who are also neurodiverse, they don't really like using Zoom, because what they used to do pre-lockdown is get together physically and together in the same space. And they would go for bike rides. They would do things that would stimulate them and give them stuff to talk about. But now, of course, they're sitting at home facing a laptop or a mobile phone, and they find there's not much to talk about, actually. So as she puts it, I want this to be over to also be able to talk to people again face to face. All right, next slide. Here's our Dev BSL participant. He's 50s. He lives with his partner in London. And he just talks about the frustration that he feels when his interpreter keeps freezing. And this kind of sense of isolation is really palpable for the deaf community, especially at this time. We have another participant who's hard of hearing, and she also pointed out this kind of thing. So we have some participants, on the other hand, found that Zoom was online platforms were an excellent way to connect with people. So online singing classes. At the same time, others said, you know what, I think I'm pretty antisocial. I'm a bit of an introvert, and I don't mind that, Okay, next. This is the last slide of the quotes. So we've got a wheelchair user who has quite limited mobility dexterity, and he does everything from his phone, essentially. So for him, a laptop, he does own a laptop, but the laptop, he uses it almost never. He finds that these video conference calls are easier on the laptop than on the mobile phone, which for him is a problem, and he would like for the video calls to be better on mobile. And these last few quotes are just from participants, 2 of whom are really tired of the news cycle. This was our older participants, many of them. And as the one in the middle says, I don't need to know how many people are dying. It really doesn't help me at this point. And so that affects her mental health. And as the diary study goes on, it's interesting how this continues. Okay, so last slide. This is just a little teaser here. The top left is a mood map. We've actually, we ask everyone a set of questions, and one of the questions is on a scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel today? And then tell us about it. So this allows us then to make these mood maps, and really to correlate issues like this very graphically and sort of showcase them. So as you can see here, the BSL participant had these dips on Monday and Thursday into bad mood, kind of unhappy face territory, and these were directly related to the broadband issues, and he was on the phone with the broadband company and everything. So interestingly, he did some exercise at the end of the week, which is what spiked his mood up. The other two photos here on the right-hand side just showcase some of the other challenges that people have had. I mentioned our hard of hearing participant. She found that people's masks at Waitrose, but also at other places, were impeding her ability to lip read and to understand what people were saying to her. So that's an interesting finding as well. And the bottom picture there just showcases different ways of communicating. In this case, our older participant who's self-isolating uses teddy bears as a kind of friendly gesture to her neighbors to say, hello, I'm here, do you want to chat, across the drive, the old-fashioned way. Christine, over to you.
Thank you. So the second theme, which was the theme of the second week, that is summarizes a couple of weeks of input around this theme, was around food and basics. So how people are actually getting food, how they're getting also anything else that they need for their day-to-day living. And four kind of major themes that we've picked up here. The first one is the reliance on other people to help get the basics. And so this varied for each individual on who they're able to rely on. People who had carers, and particularly people that had multiple different people coming in to provide care before this period, have often had to limit their care team. So they either have no carer or they have far fewer days or support of carers. So it's coming down to a much smaller group of people with more of a load of care, but also around getting things to them. Those that are completely shielding, obviously they're trying to keep their whole household not having to leave home and getting deliveries in, and depending on whether they're classified as vulnerable or not, that makes that easier or much harder to do. But generally that support from others has been incredibly important for many people just to get their basics. And that's family, that's carers, that's also community. So things like having a local supermarket support where people haven't got on the vulnerable customer list, but just a local independent supermarket has said that they'll support them and help them. The fact that, not surprising to anyone working in the inclusive design space, but there are so many differing ways in which it's challenging to people. And, we knew to expect this, but it was just very interesting to see how communication obviously is absolutely critical, particularly for deaf customers in supermarkets with masks now being used, both limiting the ability to lip read, but also muffling sound. Putting things in bags, now people can't get help from the assistants in the supermarkets, can be very hard for people with dexterity challenges, and they can't go with someone else who can help them. Things like one-way customer flow systems for particularly larger supermarkets that are trying to move people through the same direction so they're not crossing each other's paths. That can be very difficult to people who learn differently or dyslexic or dyspraxic. Anxiety has increased for a lot of people, and it's hard to get some of the specific foods that we have, 2 gluten intolerant and 1 very specific diet amongst our group of 13, and they all found challenges with that. On the positive side, there's some really great support that has been valued and appreciated, not just from carers, but from organisations. During this period of these 2 weeks, that was when vulnerable customer lists, both from the government and individual organisations, were starting to kind of settle down and be used. At this point, some people had made it onto that list and others hadn't, and that was a quite new line of inclusion and exclusion. Even though on both sides of that line we had people with some really quite strong needs. Some people had felt very appreciated and really felt very loyal to the brand. Things like the cleanliness of stores and early hours for vulnerable customers have been really appreciated, and also great service support. So where a local store had supported one of our participants who hadn't at the point got onto a vulnerable customer list, that had been super appreciated by her and made a very big difference over that period. And again, on the fun side of food and basics, a lot of people were getting a bit creative, either because they were having to, because they were making do, such as looking in their freezer and saying, what meal can I make from there? Or because they were just wanting to and starting to make things more from scratch. And yes, you'll see in the photos, we've got some images of that. Also, the way people are using food as a bit of a interaction point, and there's more people at home more of the time. So people sharing time in the kitchen and preparing foods together had been a real pleasure for a number of households. So some other quotes from that. Hearing it, the first one was that in and out of the list. So it's slightly disappointing that the government didn't manage to cover everyone in the vulnerable customer database. However, there wasn't much to be done, and we're coping nonetheless. This was from a student who's got motor neuron disease, quite significant needs. Her family that she lives with is trying to limit the exposure by going out just once a fortnight. So that's been the way they've dealt with it. But she'd been in that line of, in and out of vulnerability, hadn't made that list at that point. On the other side, our female student who's living with Crohn's disease had been acknowledged as a vulnerable customer. And at this point, she said, that's absolutely amazing. But she had also had some real challenges getting food and getting specific foods. And she has a really specific diet. And it was very difficult to get some of the things that keep her healthy. And, this is all a health crisis, but actually we want to keep people healthy through it as well. And for her, that's getting increasingly difficult. Our female participant who's in her 50s, she's been a very, very loyal client of Ocado, basically shopping there weekly for 13 years since her children were born. She said just after lockdown, the app pretty well got stopped. Everything had collapsed because of the increased demand, kind of shutting that system down. The website was still operating though. It would take hours of waiting for her to get. It was failing also. She was ordering, said, I was ordering food between 3 and 5 a.m. As I didn't know the website well, it also took me ages. Since then, I've been put on the priority list due to past loyalty. I've been very lucky for being loyal, but no one acknowledged my vision impairment difficulties, even though I can't shop independently in a supermarket. So for her loyalty allowed her to get onto the priority list, which was fabulous. But the fact that she had limited independence to do so, to shop in a store and maintain social distancing because she's visually impaired, wasn't taken into account. For our deaf participant in her 50s, she said, it's quite an expedition these days going to Waitrose. Being deaf, it's hard to hear beyond the masks. I can't see, so that's not easy, because she can't see the mouth is what she means there. For our female participant in her 40s who's dyslexic and dyspraxic, she went into one of the largest stores to do a bigger shop at one point in this fortnight and said, inside the store we were meant to follow a one-way system where you went up one aisle and down the other. I don't necessarily shop up and down every aisle, and I kept going the wrong way. I couldn't get the hang of going the right way at all. It wasn't clearly signposted where to go to the checkout. A few others for our male participant whose mobility and dexterity limited. He's relying on carers and he's limited his team, and he said it's great to have someone who provides care to get the groceries, who I also know and trust to be careful about not interacting with too many people, because he's really trying to completely shield, and he needs to have someone coming in and he really trusts them. He also got a slot with Waitrose, so he did his first big shop since the start of the lockdown, and that created a real boost for him that week. And one from our female in her 20s with low IQ and ADHD. She said, normally I'd struggle to concentrate with recipes, having to read it once and remember it. Then I'd read it out loud again before cooking. This time the steps were simple, so I knew what I was doing. This is when her mum had helped her kind of simplify a bread recipe, and they were cooking that together. And our blind participant was also using BBC Good Food via Alexa to do some cooking. So yes, the Great British Bake Off was happening. We have a range of different foods being made and baked. The list was really defining as to who felt supported and who didn't, and people were making do in lots of different ways, either from their freezer or by shopping in larger amounts over fewer shops per period. Right. So some of the key takeaways from this, and I hesitate a little bit to use Bonaparte in England, but I love this quote, which is, "In today's complex and fast-moving world, what we need even more than foresight or hindsight is insight." And I think the faster the pace, that's a 200-year-old quote, but it's still so relevant today, because the faster the pace, the less relevant anything that we knew before or may know in the future is going to be. So just an overall view of what this has given us. I think this is something we shared a few weeks ago, and it's in a blog we wrote, but at the beginning of the lockdown. But essentially, with things changing so fast, there's a few things to really look at for any organisation. The first is not all parts of the organisation are equally relevant to people now. So really determining what are those critical areas, those critical customer journeys for review. So really understanding what are the jobs to be done that customers wanting, what are their priorities, what are the needs that they need met through this period that may be different to what they were 3 months ago or 6 months ago. And then determining the staff jobs and priorities that support those needs. Then asking people, and really, as we have here, understanding from people who are most impacted what their experiences are. That's not just people with disabilities, but also with long-term health conditions, older consumers, those in the health professions or other professions that are specifically impacted, those who are emotionally less resilient and also financially less resilient over this period. Then that can give you the base to be able to reset the priorities, to make some changes, to make the actions get out of people's way and enable the teams to be able to make the changes required, and then assess and adapt based on the impact of that. So that's the overall process. In terms of just thinking about how you can provide the insight for that, and I do acknowledge Jutta from OCAD, the university in Toronto, who's actually Tom's old alma mater, for this diagram, even though we kind of recreated it. But it's that experience at the edge of needs, those kind of edge case experiences that provide a much richer depth of insight, especially if you're trying to do a small amount of insight regularly, which is probably the most powerful in a period of great change. So some organizations will just keep to what is, in the image I've got here, a pink circle in the middle, where if you've got 6 people's views within that, that'd all be quite similar. You can extend that out to kind of the 80 percentile of people, which is a blue circle here outside of that. If you've got 6 people there, you get a broader range of experiences, but still not covering off the edges of experience of all the consumers involved with the business. If you get 6 around the extreme edges, you're going to cover everything from within, but you're also going to understand the extremities of that experience and the people that would be most likely to be excluded if they weren't understood at this time. And also, in this period, the impacts of that exclusion can be the most profound. So yes, exclusion, the impacts are changing. Those characteristics of needs are changing. So we've got here things like at-risk professions, which have obviously changed very significantly in the last 3 months. Digital exclusion is very pertinent right at the moment, with people not being able to go out so much. They're needing to use digital tools, and whether it's accessibility, digital accessibility, the usability, and that combination of skills, needs, and the design or mismatch of that, tools that people might be using, such as assistive technology tools, and the connectivity and actually having devices. So especially in households where maybe they had 1 device, but they've now got 2 children at school, someone working, and also needing to do the shopping and so on with that, significantly changes who's included and excluded. Moving beyond just disability and access needs in a physical or cognitive sense, also thinking about mental health and social and financial exclusion and how that's changing through this period. So in terms of communication, a couple of things that would put as guidelines. Obviously, there's a lot more we could put here, but just as a starting point on this, some of the tips that we'd suggest in terms of digital tools, choosing a tool that's accessible. and also usable to all users. Building inclusive communication skills in a team or a group, so sharing with people how to communicate more effectively using the digital tools. Act to be accessible prior to and through the session. As an example, we have someone providing the closed captions here, and that just took a little bit of time to set up before the session, but the tool is there and available to do so. It's just setting that up in a way that makes that happen. And then assessing it, so asking people if there's anything that they're missing out on or feels not working so well for them. Some specific ones for people with vision needs and vision impairments: verbally describing any visuals that you wish to communicate, hearing, providing captioning, sign language, cameras on, and good lighting, so people who lip read can see people. And for cognitive, thinking about one thing at a time, having it well structured, clarity, providing breaks, particularly if it's a longer session, and check-ins with people. And for in-person communication, obviously masks are a real issue in terms of hindering communication, will probably be more so as people start to come out of lockdown. So thinking about how masks can hinder communication and providing alternatives, whether it's written signs, that particularly someone who's got a regular communication or things they need to ask can use, or using digital apps where they can provide a text-based alternative to verbal language. I think the number one takeaway here is for any face-to-face training staff to understand that people are coming in with all sorts of different contexts, needs, and potential access requirements. With more than 80% of disability being invisible, don't assume of any customer why someone might be, maybe not socially distancing. They might have vision and not be aware of that. So rather than making any assumptions, ask people, particularly if you're going to step in and offer some support, rather than assuming and getting it slightly wrong. And in terms of visual communications, provide alternatives. So particularly if you're thinking about things like new signage in a store or new signage in a workplace, how does that work for people who think differently or see differently? What alternatives are you providing for them, such as tactile flooring for one-way systems in a supermarket? In terms of food and basics, a couple of tips in terms of digital, and online purchasing. Really understanding the points of exclusion to start with. So for each organisation, understanding your own target customer base and understanding where people might be excluded, and doing the work to really extract that, and so you can resolve for that. Providing layered customer service. So we're seeing with the vulnerable customer lists, there's already kind of at least 2 layers, but potentially providing more where you can support people who are differentially impacted differentially, so that there is more support for people who have greater impacts and greater exclusion through this period. Load and stress robustness and stability is not something that's easy to fix. Obviously people are in catch-up mode, but nobody expected the volume change that happened at the beginning of this period. And there is a layer of just catching up to that, that I know a lot of organisations are working very hard on at the moment, so that their systems themselves are crashing less under greater load. Prioritising core journey accessibility. So really thinking about what are those critical journeys that customers are needing to come into to the purchasing journey, find what they need, buy it, and get the delivery options selected. So test that with diverse users, think of it end to end, and really prioritise those improvements around the key journeys and those most impacted by that, or those most limited to going to an in-store option. And understand how delivery options can impact that overall journey, because there is still a physical element, even obviously to digital purchasing. So understanding how that works with different people and where that works better or worse. Specific times, such as early shopping periods for people with additional vulnerabilities, are really appreciated, especially if it's early, because that's seen that the store would be the cleanest. Understanding the entering system, and if there's queuing, for some people queuing is really limiting and might need a seat. I know some banks in the past have provided seating where people can kind of use a ticket system that they're virtually in position 2 and they're moving up the queue, but they don't need to physically stand and move up it. considering wayfinding and flow as people are particularly changing that wayfinding and flow, and making sure that everyone can understand those changes and adapt to them effectively. And staff service, that empathy, and trying to support the staff, understand that people are coming in with all sorts of backgrounds, needs, and contexts today, and helping by that, how can I help question first, rather than any assumption as to why someone might be doing something, say touching an item on the shelf, to see it and bring their eyes closer to it, as an example. And then payment. There's some real challenges with using the protective layers around payment systems. Obviously, we're moving away from cash towards point of sale, digital payments. So understanding who that might exclude and where that might not work so well, say for someone who's a wheelchair user trying to reach it, if it can't reach down to them or move up to someone who's very tall, that becomes difficult. And clear screens that are very hard to see, even more hard to see for someone with a visual impairment, and can be hard to understand for someone who thinks differently. Well, how do I get that food? Is there an underneath or around the side, or how do I pick up my bag? So just helping people work their way through what is a very new experience for us all. On to Tom.
All right. So this is, I believe, our last slide before we go to the Q&A. So obviously, we have 4 more weeks of research and themes, more voices, more stories. We got 4 more themes to go. So we've got health and fitness, work, finances, and leisure and entertainment. Now, what's interesting here is that I don't have to tell you, but obviously the UK has seen significant changes to lockdown. So we're already a few weeks out from when we accumulated these insights, and the diary study is still going. So, our participants are sharing their experience of these ongoing changes as some restrictions are being eased. And I think that's also providing an interesting lens here on everything. And it's likely that the end of our 6-week diary study is going to correspond to that period of even greater change, when there may be schools reopening, lockdown easing further, etc. So we obviously look forward to presenting more insights from our participants in the next session. We'll let you know when and where that is. It'll be on Zoom most likely. But also we welcome interest from any of you who would like to talk to us about perhaps extending this pilot in any sort of way to get richer insights, or maybe to get insights specific to your particular industry. So yeah, we look forward to talking to you about that. Is that it? That's it.
So over to everyone for Q&A. Please, when you ask a question, you're welcome to unmute yourself and just ask it directly yourself. But yes, was that surprising? Was that what you expected? How are the experiences relative to what you might have thought prior to that?
I think it's Rachel Van here, and really good, very good insights. And actually some of them I've experienced myself. One of the questions that I have got, and it may not because of the cohort, but did you experience any insight from the food shopping when it came to self-service? Self-service checkouts, for example, and also when they go to click and collect. Now, they may not necessarily do that, but that's where I'm seeing barriers personally. So I didn't know whether that had come out in any of your insights.
I'm more than, I'll have a start, and Tom, please add anything, or Olivia, who's the researcher who's been listening to each of the individual pieces, please jump in. Starting point is we didn't get a lot of click and collect, so I don't have any specific on that, Rachel. In terms of point of sale and that self-service, we do know that that's specifically limiting to some people. So some point of sale, some self-service checkouts are not designed for people with vision impairments, and are difficult for anyone who's got reach or height issues, such as a wheelchair user. The majority, or quite a few of our panel participants have themselves not been going into stores, so I think those that have more profound needs tend to be shielding, so it's more that other people are going in and providing that service for them. So, and actually, I don't think we had a lot of challenges in this group. Tom, have you got anything specific on that one?
No, I totally agree with you. That pretty much summarizes it. I will just add that we had one vision impaired participant who was not blind, but just severely vision impaired. She did go into store on a number of occasions. And what's interesting here is when she tried to use the self-checkout, as well as in general shopping throughout the store, she needs to bring everything very close to her face in order to see it. And that was causing her anxiety around health, and it was actually meaning that she was distancing herself from the screen and had more trouble than she normally would with that process. So that does come to mind.
Thank you, Rachel. Louise, let me go to you.
Hi, Christine. I've been very interested to listen to this. So for others who might not know, I'm the program manager for the DFID-funded high volume transport program, which is about research. It's primarily in transport for low income countries, but inclusion is a big part of our program. And I was interested to hear if there was anything that came from this, you know, that we can use for our low income country beneficiaries. I mean, I think I'm not an expert in the subject, but I think probably a lot of the stuff that you're presenting is probably not a huge surprise for a lot of people. But I was also wondering, you know, what are you doing to get this information out more widely? Because I suspect even in this group, you're talking to people who are already interested in inclusion and want to hear what's coming out. But how are you getting this information to people, even the stores and so on, who may not really be aware of the issues that these people are finding, and what, you know, not pressurizing, but certainly lobbying and advocating for them to change their systems to make it easier for the shoppers and for the people that are using their services.
Thank you, Louise. That's an excellent question, and actually one I've been worrying about quite a bit. So yes, good question. Do I have a perfect answer? No. The point is, we decided to do this research ourselves because we realised getting funding at the moment to get something like this done too hard. We have the ability to get these insights. We'll just get them and we'll share them as widely as possible. What we're trying to do, we've invited, you know, a smaller number of people to this today, you know, people that we know, hence they're probably already within the inclusion bubble. Completely correct on that note. And we will then share it online for anyone who wants to come to it. We're also doing things like talking at the Digital Leaders Lounge and, you know, other forums where we can get that out hopefully a little further beyond. I'm very open to how we share this more widely and what's most relevant to be shared more widely, because I think there are some important insights, and the further we can get it, the faster we can get it, the more relevant it is to people. We're not trying to sit on it. This is, you know, we're wanting to open source this as quickly and effectively as possible. Any ideas from any of you, please do share them back to us. Just in terms of the low income countries, to pick up on that, it is very interesting across our cohort where we do have quite different incomes and quite different financial anxiety situations at the moment. You know, some people with higher income but lower stability, other people, you know, with lower income, higher stability because say they're still in their family, but there's a range of different financial pressures across this group. It will be interesting to see it across those 6 weeks because we know financial pressure is one of the elements that's changing quite rapidly. It does change people's ability to adapt to this very significantly. So those, as an example, who have professional paid carers who are still using those professional paid carers because they've got the wherewithal to do so are obviously able to shield more effectively than those who can't do that. So definitely there is a financial impact that goes that has a double up effect on inclusion and exclusion at this moment, and we see that that's only going to get more profound as the financial impacts go wider.
Okay, no, that's thanks. The only reason I ask is because, you know, we face the same thing whereby, you know, if we do something around a particular topic, all the people that are there are people who, you know, are interested, and it's a hard job to get it out to, you know, to open the minds of people who are not aware.
Any ideas from any of the crowd here today, please send them through to us. We'd really welcome it. We are trying to share this as widely as possible.
I'll just add to that, that even though, you know, transport is a hugely important topic, and it's not one of our 6 themes that we were looking at in this diary study, although it feeds into things like work and it feeds into the other themes that we're looking at. But obviously, so for those that don't know, we've worked a lot in travel and transport actually, and had some. So what we find is that the inclusiveness of travel and transport is an area that we're very familiar with. It's a hugely important area to people who are disabled, have access needs, or are older.
Obviously, a little less important at the moment in lockdown.
Yeah, there is that factor of it
It will become increasingly so as people are expected to go back into their education or their workplaces, or wishing to move around a bit more to get to medical appointments and so on as they start to open up. But that's why it wasn't one of the themes, even though it is a critically important part of our society more broadly.
Yeah.
I had a comment, if I may. I just wanted to say something, if that's all right.
Yes, please.
Yeah, hi, it's Bryn from
How are you?
Hey, Bryn.
And thank you for today's presentation. I think we did quite a lot of like sentiment analysis internally through, well, mostly through like social channels. We had some very negative sentiment towards us around not prioritizing, first prioritizing disabled customers, and then going with the government with the critically vulnerable list. But we did also receive some really positive comments, and it was really nice to see that represented in your presentation. I'll share that back with my colleagues. But I think it's fair to say that it was a really challenging time. So much of our groceries business still is a challenging time. So much of our groceries business is done in store, and then trying to convert, that into a purely digital business there's an issue around capacity as well as everything else. But anyway, I'm sort of slightly going off on a tangent here. But what I wanted to say in response to Louise is that we've started working, and I know that other supermarkets do as well, with charities. So, for example, the Royal National Institute of the Blind came to us with some very, touching on some of the stuff that you touched on for visually impaired people like myself, being in store, not being able to read things, needing to pick things up to get them closer to your face, and the challenges that come around that with social distancing and all of that sort of stuff. So they have actually given us stuff to share amongst our store colleagues. But the logistics of that, like wider education piece, so the context being there are 190,000 employees that work with Sainsbury's, Argos, and across the brands, is huge. So even with those insights coming into the business from charities or from organisations like yourself, it still takes time.
Of course.
And we totally understand that, Bryn, and in fact that's why we're wishing to share this with organisations like yourself.
It's an interesting thing in the reason I'm sort of labouring it a bit is it's in the context of a fast, ever-changing time. By the time you've got one thing, there's another thing, and so on. But I think in general, these insights are not necessarily exclusive to this time, so they're very relevant. Yeah.
Thank you, Bryn. And we do really understand that all organisations that have got significantly changed customer requirements over this period, in very difficult circumstances, in trying to make a lot of change in a small amount of time to support rapidly changing large customer needs, is hard for any organisation. So, let's start with that. Anne, let me go to you. Thank you. You've got a question to ask.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid it's transport again, but in a sense I don't apologise, because as we've said, it is so crucial.
Yeah.
I hope in the context of your themes over the next 2 weeks, you will get some insight into this. What I've been looking at and getting very concerned about is that those people with disabilities who are now starting to go out and to travel, either to work or to get to shops or whatever, are having huge problems with the social distancing For example, a lot of the seats on the buses are taped off, often including wheelchair space. People who need physical assistance, either for guiding or for helping with wheelchair, are being refused by staff for very understandable reasons, because they haven't got the protective equipment and they're not able to give that one-to-one help. In the pedestrian environment, all these nice extra wide pavements that are being set up are causing a lot of confusion for people with low vision who don't know which side they're walking. Are they in the road? Are they on the pavement? And so on. So just to say that I've been really interested in your study, and I hope that it will come out as a matter of course with your next themes, that we get some insights into what happens when people do start to try moving about. Because I think a lot of the operators and authorities have been so preoccupied with getting social distancing right, they've actually forgotten there's a lot of people out there for whom that causes another set of barriers. Thanks.
Definitely.
Tom, do you want to first? Yeah.
I'll jump in just to say absolutely right. And it's an interesting thing because there's always that flip side. So as you say, the social distancing, everyone's staying at home. What's interesting is in the diary study, we are now seeing people moving out more, right? So that's happening. And transport is impacted, and not only public transport, but even many of our people who are quite severely disabled have adapted cars, adapted vehicles. They wonder about taking care of their cars. What do they need to do? You know, how can they get back on the roads in various ways? So it's an interesting lens that is actually coming out in the diary.
I can give you one little study, one little example from this week's diary study, actually, Anne, which is quite interesting. So one of our participants has MS and has a daughter who's in her early 20s and working. And her work is going to come back on, I think, next week. Now, she doesn't want her daughter to use public transport because, of course, that limits the shield around this lady, because you know, she has a significant health issue and is quite concerned about, you know, bringing COVID back into her home. So she's going to end up paying for taxis or, you know, private transport for her daughter to get to work and back. She herself isn't going to go out, but she's going to, you know, pay for private transport rather than allow her daughter to use public transport. So again, this is that crossover between inclusion, exclusion, financial and physical. It's going to get quite interesting and quite complex, and it's complex in ways that are new to people. So I'm like you, Anne, I'm really looking forward to learning where those points are so we can share them out more broadly and people can start to adapt to them a little bit better.
Thank you.
Right, we are on time. Is there anyone with a last question that they would like to ask, or otherwise I will just say thank you to everyone for today.
Is it okay to ask a question still?
Please.
Sure.
So it's Richard Hull here. So comment, first of all, I was very struck by the reminder that some of the interventions like masks and cash-free shopping are just introducing new problems, and that there's a natural tendency for authorities to focus on the majority issue, if you like, and forget. So that was interesting. But my question relates to something you hinted at the beginning, but I'd just like to ask you to recap if possible, which are changes that have been forced on participants as a result of the disruption, which actually turn out to be positive and things they'd like to continue afterwards. Could you give some examples of those?
Thank you. I'm happy to start on this one, then I'll throw to you, Tom. But
yeah,
I am very, very optimistic about the long-term inclusive impact of this period, in that because we're having to adapt to a much more extreme environment that everybody is in for a new and different reason, that's requiring us to use digital in new and different ways, to be essentially mobility limited, everyone, for this period, to undertake their basic needs such as getting food or entertainment and so on in new and different ways. And therefore, I think there's going to be a level of empathy around those that need to do this quite a lot. There's also a level of learning that can happen from the communities that have already had different reasons that they've had mobility challenges, say long-term health conditions, not being able to leave home for a period of time. They've already learned how to do a lot of this. So I think there's quite a few positives to come from this in terms of inclusion supporting people now understand and work out how best to manage this environment, and then the empathy and the understanding that comes from everyone being here feeding into a more inclusive environment longer term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll just add to that. Great question, Richard. So I mentioned our student who has access now to education materials that she needs to study for her exams. The other two big areas where we're noticing differences, and you know, it'll be interesting after the lockdown, is in communication and leisure. So with communication, obviously Zoom now has taken off. And as I mentioned, even people who are quite untech savvy, which are not always older people, but just in general, people who just are not that comfortable with tech, are using Zoom and finding it actually fairly usable and quite easy to use, which is a great plus. So it'll be interesting to see what the ramifications of that are. And then in terms of leisure and entertainment, online classes have taken off, and there's been a burgeoning kind of openness of providers who are providing exercise and other types of lifestyle classes, yoga, meditation for free, for example, which might not be a long-term sustainable model for them, but it's interesting how that's now led to this uptake of all this new leisure, entertainment, and fitness type of activities online. So that's just some of the examples, and to just put a cherry on it is a very, very short example here of our same BSL participant was talking about doing a BSL yoga class, and some of the access challenges of having signed interpreter, okay, because these are all BSL people doing the class, but while he's doing a downward dog, he also has to look at the visual of the sign language. So there's some interesting new challenges and opportunities that are emerging there. But those are just some very, very brief examples.
It does, the inclusion perspective on that though is really interesting, because if you think about a signed yoga class, he went to a signed yoga class before, but you had to be physically within the space. You know, he lives in London, so you know, there's a lot of people around, but someone who's a BSL speaker who's in Northern Yorkshire probably doesn't have local access to a signed yoga class.
Exactly, yeah, that's
Therefore,
right.
moving it online will allow, you know, specific communities access to services that they might not have had before. So it is an interesting time. We are at time, people. Thank you all for coming today. We really appreciate it. Any additional questions you've got, please just shoot them through to Tom or myself. You can contact us at contact@openinclusion.com, or either tom@openinclusion.com or christine@openinclusion.com. So we're fairly easy to reach. We look forward to catching up with you post-lockdown or during it as we go forward. If you're interested in coming to the next session, please just send us a note. We'll probably invite everyone that's been here anyway. But yes, if you'd like to pass it through to any colleagues or friends, or if you think that there's another forum that we can share this information with, do please tell us. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.